Well, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us tonight for this special Kohima Educational Trust event, where we are going to be talking to Michael Shipster and hearing from Fergal Keane, who the author, of course, of A Road of Bones, which many of you will have read. I think we've got about over 200 people joining us tonight. We've got large numbers piling into the auditorium as we speak, and it's a real pleasure to have you on board. We're welcoming people from around the world, as we usually do, from Australia, Canada, United States, United Kingdom, of course, India, well over 100 now. So it's very good to see you all. And I hope you enjoy it. If you, you will enjoy it. If you've got any questions, stick them in the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and answer questions at the end. If we can't answer them, either Michael or myself, we will make sure that we put up some responses on the website so that people don't feel shortchanged. Anyway, over to Sylvia.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks, Rob, and welcome to another Kohima Educational Trust webinar. Tonight, as Rob has already intimated, we are departing a little bit from our regular format. We like to try and keep things fresh, and we'll be bringing you a recording of Fergal Keane talking about the Siege of Kohima. As you know, Fergal wrote the book, The Road of Bones, and we are delighted that he was firstly able to make this recording for us for the weekend that we held at the National Army Museum, and secondly, allowing us to screen it for all of you, and so that we can reach a wider audience, and so can he. To bring this recording into context and here with us this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Michael Shipster, who is actually an old friend of Fergal's. I'll let him tell you more about that, because it is a fascinating story in itself. But for those of you who don't know him, Michael is a former British diplomat who served in Moscow, Delhi, Johannesburg, and Washington, amongst others. His father was John Shipster, a veteran of the Burma campaign, who commanded an infantry company of the Punjab Regiment and later wrote The Mist on the Rice Fields. On graduating in 1972 from Oxford, Michael worked as an economist in Botswana before joining the Foreign Office. And after 9/11, he was appointed director for the Middle East and Africa. Michael now runs his own company, advising British charities on international issues and government relations. And we are really delighted to have him here with us tonight. And of course, gluing us all together is the wonderful Dr. Robert Lyman, author of many books on the subject of the Burma campaign, and who I think may have mentioned this last time, has embarked on writing the definitive account of the Battle of Kohima, which will be a greatly anticipated tome. As always, I think Rob's already said, we'll take the questions at the end, but as they occur to you, please do jot them down onto the chat or the Q&A so that Rob has them to hand at the end. So now over to you, Rob. Thanks.
Thanks, Sylvia. And just a few short words from me. We don't want to elongate this beyond that which is necessary. This began from a weekend which we in the KET in the National Army Museum held on the 20th and the 21st of April this year at the National Army Museum, where we celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Kohima with a number of fabulous talks by historians and enthusiasts. And one of the people I had arranged to come along and talk to us was Fergal Keane, the author of A Road to Bones. I first came across Fergal when he was writing this book. It must have been 14 or 15 years ago now. And I think I met Michael actually at the book launch in London a long time ago. It's suffice it to say, Fergal's book has been a bestseller. It's a very important book, and it tells primarily the story of the siege and the battle that followed it, based around the memoirs in part of Michael's father. More of that anon. So we were delighted to have Fergal agree to come along and speak to us. And as Sylvia's mentioned, the reality is life intervened, and Fergal, being a journalist for the BBC, was sent off at short notice to Israel. But he agreed to leave us with a video or interview, which we're going to watch tonight. So I'm going to ask John Shipster to say a few words, more than a few words, I hope, of introduction to his relationship with Fergal and describe something of his father's war. And when we're ready, I'll share my screen and we'll watch Fergal talking to us about the epic Siege of Kohima. Thank you, Michael.
My father went to India in the beginning of 1941 and was commissioned into the 2nd Punjab Regiment. In 1943, he and his regiment were sent to the Arakan, and they saw fierce fighting there. And later, he took part in the relieving force at Kohima, and then the pursuit of the Japanese into Burma. It was a very, very tough time. His battalion took 50% of casualties. And by the time the end of the Arakan campaign, aged just 22, he was a major and awarded the DSO for his leadership during that campaign. The war, it's hard to overstate the impact that the war had on him. Not just the challenges and the really tough experiences, but also the comradeship and the sense of having been part of an extraordinary enterprise with personal relationships that lasted a lifetime. So I grew up in the shadow of these experiences, but my father himself was not keen to talk about it in any detail, and his sort of shared experiences were really those with those who had served with him. In 1990, I was posted to South Africa, and my father visited us there. And while there, he and my mother were nearly killed by an attack on the house where they were staying. And in the aftermath of that, I introduced him to Fergal Keane. And he spoke then about his wartime service, saying that actually the experiences in a lonely farmhouse in Natal had been in some ways worse than serving with his men and able to face off the enemy. And Fergal's meeting with him then led to, sometime later, my asking Fergal whether he wouldn't mind interviewing John about his experiences in Burma and afterwards, in fact, in Korea, in which he also served, because he had just written his own memoirs, but typical of the certainly British soldiers, in my experience, who had taken part in such tough campaigns, he was very reluctant to talk about himself, very reluctant to express any personal reflections on what he had experienced. And the story was more a series of after dinner mess story anecdotes. Well, Fergal spent a couple of full days interviewing him and got a huge amount more detail, none of which, I might add, my father really wanted to include in the book, but we managed to smuggle some of it in. But out of that, Fergal, whom I'd got to know as a very close friend in South Africa, to the point where we were in the same rather raucous rock and roll band together, playing after the election of Mandela at the Foreign Correspondents' Ball, he became interested in Kohima, and his researches then led him to Japan, where he interviewed Japanese veterans. And in fact, I was able to accompany him to Kohima in 2009, walk the battlefield, talk to people on the spot. And out of it came, as Robert said, this superb book, telling the story from a number of different vantage points. And Fergal is now going to talk about the whole process of putting the story together, and we're going to hear it now in the video.
Good afternoon, and I so wish that I could be with you. By the time you hear me speaking now, I will be already in Jerusalem. It's one of the hazards of my job that I can get called away at the last minute to cover breaking news events, and I'm here now covering a war, a very different war to the one that you're discussing this afternoon. But one I think we should bear in mind has many of its roots in the Second World War. Now, I came to the story of Kohima quite by accident. I'd long had an interest in the history of what happened between 1939 and 1945, but most of my interest, I have to say, was focused on the European theatre. And then I had the great good fortune, while working in South Africa, to meet a man called Michael Shipster, a Foreign Office diplomat, who became a good friend of mine. And over the course of several years, as our friendship deepened, he told me about his father and his father's experiences. It was John Shipster, his experiences during the Second World War as an officer in the Indian Army. And then time passed and we both moved back to the United Kingdom. And Michael got in touch with me and said that his father wanted to leave behind a kind of memoir, I should put it that way, for the family. And would I, because I had experience of interviewing people over many, many years and drawing them out, would I come and speak with his father? And we would record the conversations, and these then could be put into a book, a small book, for family and friends. I, of course, immediately agreed out of friendship, but also I have to say out of curiosity, because Michael had told me some of the details of his father's experience, and it was quite staggering to me, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Anyway, I went down to Michael's home in Winchester, and we sat and spoke, and I listened. I did a lot of listening. There actually wasn't a need for a huge number of questions. And I was struck, of course, instantly by the humility of John Shipster. He was describing experiences which made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And I'm somebody who had quite a bit of experience of war and combat situations, but I have to say that nothing that I'd witnessed myself, or indeed anything I'd read before about combat in the Second World War, or in any of the subsequent wars, quite matched the intensity, the brutality and savagery of the experience that John Shipster related to me. And I do remember very much asking him, in retrospect, a naive question, but I said, what was his proudest achievement of the war? And he just looked at me and he said, I survived. And I came away from those encounters with a thing that many writers will be familiar with, a kind of nagging demand that won't go away, an insistence that I needed to go back to this story. I needed to talk to more people. And of course, that's what happened. Kohima kept at me, as it were. And I decided to write a book. And The Road of Bones was that book. And in the course of writing, I travelled the length and breadth of Britain. I spoke to veterans from many, many different units. I spent days in researching in archives. And I, of course, went to Kohima itself. Not an easy thing for journalists, because of course there is a continuing conflict in that area, and it's journalists aren't always welcome. But I managed to be able to go there. I went with Michael Shipster. And I also went to Japan. Now, Japan was a critical element of the story for me, because it struck me as one part that, while the story of Kohima has been brilliantly told by other authors, I felt there was more that could be found by going to Japan and speaking to the veterans there. And I did that with the help of the granddaughter of a war veteran, Yuki Tsunada. And I traveled around Japan and met men who'd fought as frontline soldiers, as privates, as NCOs. And I met a son of one of the principal Japanese commanders. And that was an absolutely fascinating journey, because while there was so much that was different in the way that they perceived the war and the way that British and Indian and other fighting men on the Allied side saw the war, there was a commonality. And I'll tell you what it was. It was this experience that many veterans spoke to me of, returning to a country that no longer wanted to know about war. Now, for very different reasons. By the time the men of the 14th Army came back from Burma, the war in Europe had been long over, and people had already, to use that dreadful modern phrase, moved on. And the emphasis was, quite understandably, on rebuilding Britain and creating a society fit for heroes. In Japan, they came back to a country that was utterly devastated, that had been led into a ruinous war by a militaristic clique. And people did not want to look back on that. It was a land, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but a land where the soldier had gone from being the sort of ideal of Japanese manhood and war, the highest profession, into something of shame because of the ruin it had brought on Japan. So it simply wasn't talked to. And the phrase formed in my mind, these quiet fathers, because men on both sides went home, and the majority of them, in my experience of interviewing veterans, they did not speak. And that's why it was such a privilege for me to be able to speak to John Shipster first, and then to speak to many, many more veterans. Why was this invasion, what the Japanese called Operation Ha-Go, the advance into India, so important for Japan? Well, the first thing you've got to bear in mind is that Japan was now on the defensive. The great victories like the fall of Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and others were a distant memory. American forces were now beginning to turn the tide, or had already turned the tide in the Pacific. And in India, a rebuilt and rejuvenated British, Indian, and other colonial forces were gathering strength, preparing the Japanese new for an offensive. So you did, of course, have Japanese propaganda insisting that this invasion was the march on Delhi. The Japanese overall commander of the attack, Renya Mutaguchi, a notoriously vainglorious and arrogant man, insisted after the war that the advance into India was about nothing less than winning the Great Far Eastern War. We can test that against, of course, what his superiors thought. Back in Tokyo, the senior command of the army saw this as the essential move that would forestall, as I said a few moments ago, a British attack into Burma. The British were already menacing Burma from the Japanese point of view. And of course, if they took Burma, then the road would be open to further conquests into Indochina and, of course, further east. Also, it was very important from a Japanese perspective militarily, that they try and sever the air link which kept the Chinese nationalist forces supplied, that link which came out of India and crossed the Himalayas and enabled the armies of Chiang Kai-shek to keep fighting. The Japanese wanted that to end. So they had very strong motivations. Slim, the commander of the British forces, did say that he saw this as an attempt to isolate China, but also an offensive that was being carried out with the hope of fomenting unrest in India. And of course, you had the Indian nationalist leader, the leader of the Indian National Army, Bose, saying that this was the moment, and telling the Japanese, filling them with stories of how the population would rise and welcome them if they invaded. And that, if you like, provides the context for why the Japanese did what they did. The critical point, of course, which several Japanese officers, and including some very senior ones, could see, was that if you invade, what are you going to do about supplies? In a situation where air superiority was rapidly being gained by the Allies, Japan simply didn't have the resources in terms of aircraft to supply drop its troops along what would be a 1,000-mile supply line. Now that's, you know, by any standards, a very substantial way to move arms and food and medicine to troops in the field. Doing it potentially in the monsoon period if the fighting dragged on, and over incredibly difficult terrain. That was something which would have given any sensible commander pause for thought. But of course, Renya Mutaguchi was not any sensible commander. He pushed on, believing in the indomitable spirit of the Japanese troops, and of course in his own generalship. On the latter, he fatally miscalculated. If you want to get a sense of the reservations, let's put it that way, which already existed in the Japanese command prior to the invasion, here's an extract which I came across in my research. And it's a conversation with Tojo, the imperial commander in Tokyo. And he's disturbed by a junior officer while he's taking a bath. And through the steam of the bathroom, you can just try and picture the scene. Tojo is asking questions. He says, how about the communications? Have they been properly thought out? Huh? It's a difficult country, India, you know. The other officer says, yes, sir, the whole plan has been gone into in great detail. Tojo, what about Mutaguchi? Are his plans up to schedule, eh? Has he got any problems? He's anxious to go ahead, sir, came the response. Then Tojo asks a critical question. What about air cover? We can't help him much. Does he realize that? I take it he does, sir. Then Tojo asks, now, what about the result of pushing our defensive line towards India? What problems is that going to make for us, huh? Are you sure it will make things better rather than worse? What will happen if the Allies land on the Arakan coast? Has anyone thought of that, huh? So you can see already, here's Tojo anticipating what's going to go wrong. And it went very wrong. The invasion went ahead, and as you all now know, it came a cropper at Kohima and Imphal. This weekend, you've been hearing the experiences of British and Indian Army soldiers, battles, the extraordinary defense of the tennis court at Kohima, the fight for the district commissioner's bungalow. And so I'm going to talk to you now about some of the Japanese veterans of that battle, people that I encountered. And it begins, my introduction to the Japanese experience of Kohima began with a man called Hirokubo Masao, and he was a young supply officer in the Imperial Army when he was given orders to join the march across the River Chindwan and over the mountains into India. And it's interesting because during the war at the outset, he would argue with his father, who was a merchant, and say to him, this is an essential war for Japan. And his father would say to him, no, the way to spread Japan's influence is through trade. That was a foresighted man. And he said, this war is not a war we should engage in. And the very militaristic son thought precisely the opposite and marched into India with the rest of the Japanese Imperial Army under Mutaguchi, believing that they would win. By the time they were a few weeks into the fighting at Kohima and Imphal, Hirokubo and the other Japanese knew they were facing a very different enemy. The disorganized, demoralized troops that had fled before the Japanese advance at the beginning of the war, right up through Burma and across into India, had been replaced by men with confidence, with weaponry, men who were well supplied, and of course also men who knew that surrendering to the Japanese simply wasn't an option. These were British and Indian troops who were determined to sell their lives for the highest price when facing the Japanese enemy. Men knew the stories of torture of those captured, of the appalling conditions in which they were held, of summary executions by the Japanese. And so they were very determined to fight, to hold their ground. One senses in the letters and in the interviews that I did with the Japanese, a genuine sense of shock at not only the fighting spirit that they now encountered from their enemy, but also the very plentiful nature of the ordnance that was poured down on them. And I'm speaking particularly, of course, after the relief of the siege of Kohima, when the Allied superiority in weaponry and in numbers really began to come home. And critically, of course, also in terms of food supplies. I want to read you a little extract from my book, describing the Japanese experience of that moment when the tide definitively turned in the battle. Whenever they got ready to form up, the shells began to fall. Someone said to Lieutenant Hirayama that it looked as if the sky was vomiting fire on them. Shards of metal, dirt, stones, and lumps of flesh rained down. It was so very, very loud, the artillery, he recalled. The air pressure smashed the eardrums of men close to the blast. Blood ran from their ears. Hirayama saw body pieces fly into the air. They were not pieces of the living, but of the dead, who'd been hastily buried in the previous days. Every time they formed up for an attack, units were targeted by the distant guns. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamagami lay flat on his stomach, face in the mud, as the shells landed. At the same time, he said, the trench swung like an earthquake. He and his battalion commander had been lying in the trench since the previous evening, pinned down. He poked his head up and looked with his field glasses at the British lines. Some troops he took to be Gurkhas were firing at the Japanese trenches. During one night attack, the company commander was looking for an enemy trench to attack. He made the mistake of firing a flare. The British spotted the light, and within minutes, shells were landing. He recalls, I jumped into a nearby trench. I did well because it was so small. Yamagami was amazed by the accuracy of the artillery and despaired of the slaughter. He remembered, one group would attack and be targeted and annihilated. Then another one would come up and the same thing would happen. Gradually, in a single night, an entire company would be gone. And so, in this way, the British and the Indians, army and their allies pushed the Japanese from the position of being the besiegers into being besieged over a much broader area, of course, than the original garrison at Kohima was besieged. But the moment comes when the commander of the force at Kohima, the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, is looking at the suffering of his men. And he is particularly concerned with the fact that many are now starving, dying of disease. He sees this is a broken army. Now, these men will not up and run, but he feels there is now on him, there is for him a critical decision. Does he stay and sacrifice more and more men into an unwinnable battle? Or does he try and save what is left of his army and retreat? And so he does something unthinkable for a Japanese commander at his level. And with his long record, and remember, this is a man who has served in China. He has served against the Soviets in Mongolia. He is not by any manner or means how shall I put it, a sort of political liberal or anything like that. He was very, very convinced of the rightness of Japan's imperial adventure in East Asia. But he is now looking at the condition of his men, and he is being a pragmatic general, but also, in terms of his own soldiers, a humane one. And he decides to retreat. And that brings about a clash with Renya Mutaguchi, the overall commander, a man who is utterly different in temperament and manner to Sato, who is as I've said, who is he's a quieter person. He is a stern person with himself, and he is caring of his troops in a way that Mutaguchi simply couldn't comprehend. The story of the Japanese retreat from Kohima is one of epic disaster. Thousands of men died trying to make their way back across the mountains, back across the River Chindwan into Burma, a route they had taken with such high hopes of inflicting a major defeat on the British and Indian armies. The descriptions that I gathered from veterans in Japan, but also that have been recorded over the years at the Imperial War Museum and in other places, paint a portrait of starvation, of men dying from disease. I'm going to read an extract from my book which describes precisely what was happening, or tries to describe, if it is at all possible to describe, what was happening on that retreat. Yoshiteru Hirayama, the monk's son from Tokyo, managed to avoid being abandoned in a hospital. His greatest fear was that his stretcher bearers would throw him into one of the steep ravines. It was happening with growing frequency. It was hell, he remembers. Men would throw their friends into the deep valley below. Hirayama was lucky. The men with him were from Niigata of the snows, strong men with strong will, he remembers. A recurring image in the memories of survivors is of groups of men gathering together to die. Dr. Kawaki of the 124th Regiment passed many as he was carried to the Chindwan. I saw the dead soldiers lying in groups under trees. It was a human thing. They didn't want to die alone. One would be dying and others would crawl towards him. I was sick as well, but looking at the dead, I had the will to live. His comrade Chuzaburo Tomaro explained the clinging together as a spiritual necessity. I find out people go to Riverside when they die, he says. I used to hear from my father that the spirit calls the spirit. It was true. One soldier approached the riverside and died. Then another soldier went and died next to him. He saw men left behind on stretchers. He approached one sitting soldier who appeared to have his hand raised. The man was frozen in rigor mortis. In a prisoner of war camp at the end of the war, Tomaro heard from other survivors that the British had captured deserters and had not killed or tortured them. Such civilized treatment of prisoners would have been unimaginable to the average Japanese soldier. When I heard of it, he remembered, I thought how kind the British Army was. At the top of every hill, there were groups of men who'd stopped to rest. The supply officer, Masao Hirakubo, found himself saying hello to men who were dead, just like they were taking a rest, he said. Next to him would be one already white bone. Next to one would have maggots and clothes rotted. People who died earlier were existing in the same place as ones who just sat down now. A popular soldier, a married man with children, looked up to by the others, went off on his own. After telling his friends he felt much better, he would catch up with them later. They found him, a short time afterwards, dead in the middle of the road, where he had placed his big toe in the trigger of his rifle and blown his brains out. So they're just some of the many, many testimonies describing what happened on that retreat. The fury, and of course immense sense of personal responsibility, which Kotoko Sato, their field commander, felt would be expressed in the things that he said to other officers. And of course, in his relationship with Renya Mutaguchi, the man who had sent them all over the mountain without taking care to ensure that there would be the necessary supplies of food, medicine, and of course, armaments. And I'm now going to talk about what happened after the war. Well, first I should say that Mutaguchi's response to the decision taken by Sato was one of fury. And he immediately went about trying to have Sato declared insane. Because, of course, to him it was incomprehensible. You simply couldn't surrender. But that effort failed because at least one of the psychiatrists who examined Sato, was absolutely convinced that this man was perfectly sane. What he was saying was rational. Mutaguchi could not, however, afford to bring Sato to court-martial, which would have been the obvious step. So having him declared insane was a ploy to avoid that. So had he brought him to court-martial, it would have been very evident very quickly that the planning for this expedition to India had been completely lacking, and that Mutaguchi had effectively sent his men, as he did admit when he encountered some troops on the banks of the Chinwan, or encountered another officer. He did briefly have a sort of crisis of conscience where he said, "I have killed thousands of my men," but that was very quickly replaced by the customary arrogance and blustering. And so then the army found its solution by sending Sato off to the Philippines into a non-job. When the war ends, Sato goes to his hometown and he retreats, really, from that whole military world and life that he'd known, and lives under the shadow of the man who surrendered. Now, it has to be said that his own troops, the men whose lives he saved by ordering the retreat, held him in great respect. But he became gradually more withdrawn. He drank heavily, and he became an alcoholic and died of complications related to his alcoholism. But at his funeral, Mutaguchi appeared. He came and sat with other officers. And I asked the son of Kotoko Sato, whom I met in Japan, "What did you feel about that? What did you feel about the man who had sent your father on this impossible mission into India, and which, whose consequences were, of course, catastrophe for so many thousands of people who served under him?" And his response to me was interesting. Goro Sato, the son of the Lieutenant General, remembers Mutaguchi standing there, and he said to me, "I didn't have any feeling of hatred whatsoever." He said, "I was too busy, really, dealing with the ceremony, the ritual of the funeral." And then something happened. In the middle of it all, Mutaguchi got down on his knees and said, "I'm sorry." And people were stunned. This was not the kind of thing that he did. Now, had Mutaguchi left it there, then I think people might have, well, if not forgiven him, and when I say people, I mean the men under Sato's command, but they might have seen him as a somewhat larger figure. But of course he couldn't. And subsequent to that, he publicly criticized Sato, accusing him of serious errors in leadership. And Mutaguchi did well for himself after the war. He became an officer in the Staff College of the Japan Self-Defense Force. Who knows what pearls of wisdom he managed to pass on to young officers. And Sato, it took something like 40 years for a memorial to be erected in his hometown to the memory of Kotoku Sato. That's because there was division, and there were those, particularly on the right, who believed he should not be remembered or should not be commemorated because he had surrendered. As I've said earlier, that was not the feeling among the men. Where do we end this story of the Japanese at Kohima? Well, I think the story of Mr. Hirakubo, Masao Hirakubo, is a good place to conclude, because he went back to Japan and found a job, tried to get on with life, and then he was posted by his company to Britain, and he came here, and then eventually decided to settle in Britain and work here. And he made it his business to try and promote reconciliation with British veterans of the war. Now, as many of you will know, that was a divisive issue, because a lot of people who had served in the Far East, who had emerged from the horrors of Japanese prisoner of war camps, particularly, but not just them, but particularly prisoners of war, felt that there could be no reconciliation, let alone forgiveness, of people who had inflicted such horror. Hirakubo understood this and accepted it, but he kept on with his work. And when I met him, he was coming to the end of his life. And I asked him, what his predominant feeling was. And he said, my feeling looking back on it is of the waste and the loss, and the lesson that we must learn, that all war brings the death of soldiers, it brings the death of civilians. It is invariably and maybe not invariably, but very often produces the seeds for future conflicts. But I say this in a time when we are in the midst of conflict. I've spent most of my working life as a reporter in war zones. I've always been privileged to be able to leave places when the people who are caught in the war zones can't. I've accompanied armies as they've been advancing, and I've always been able to move back and go to safety, apart from a few occasions when we were trapped. But most of the time I've been able to move back when the men at arms were being told, you've got to advance up the road, you've got to advance into that fire. And I have, understood some of what it takes to go forward into fire, but always knowing that I can go back. And it's that I think of, the extraordinary comradeship that holds men together as they go forward in battle. So many of the people who fought at Kohima told me that I didn't fight at that moment, on the tennis court, hand-to-hand combat, trying to throw back waves of attackers. I wasn't fighting for a big abstract like country or empire. I wasn't even fighting for the army. I was fighting for myself and for the man beside me. And the true nature of war, of course, is yes, it is a thing that happens between countries, between armies, but it's a thing that happens to individuals. And I think I'll leave it there and remember the quiet fathers of Kohima. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Well, over to you, Sylvia. You're on mute.
Sorry, I wasn't ready to go in there. I was on mute, that old chestnut. Well, what a master. What a great talk. Jag's already called him a master, and he is indeed. He speaks so well, doesn't he, Fergal Keane? And he's given us an insight into a relatively well-known part of the war to us anyway, but from an entirely different perspective. Fergal's book, The Road of Bones, can be purchased. I'm still quite moved from this talk, so I have to up my tone, but it can be purchased from our online shop. Just go to our website and Rob will show you a cover of it in a minute when he turns the slides. And this is the paperback edition. You can see the hardback behind me. And but all proceeds from any copy that you purchase from our online shop will go to KET. And with Father's Day round the corner, it'll also make a fine gift, as I'm sure you know. On our shop, we also have a good range of Naga items for sale, all made in Naga homes, as many of our regular viewers know, from waistcoats and bags and jewellery to gift cards. And of course, the 80th anniversary poppy pin, which I'm pleased to say are now back in stock. We've also got a specially produced Battle of Imphal poppy pin. And then just to remind all of you, our annual commemoration service is now around the corner. And if you would like to come and have not yet booked, there is still time to attend. The 80th anniversary service will be held in Dean's Park at York Minster on the 4th of July and followed by lunch at Imphal Barracks. And tickets are only £30 and it will be a wonderful occasion, as it always is. There are lots of people coming, but lots of space if you would still like to join. And to mark the 80th anniversary, we are also holding a special gala dinner on the evening before, which will be a unique occasion at the Merchant Adventurers Hall and an opportunity to hear Lord Dannatt speak after dinner. It would be lovely to see you all there. Meantime, our next webinar is just 2 weeks away on 13th of June, when Easter in Kiri will give a presentation of Naga voices from the war, a subject little known about. And we hope to see you then. And meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to next time.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone.